Hello, everyone. Prem Tucker here. Thank you for joining us for Zeteo Town Hall, one that is, as you know, of utmost importance. What is happening in Iran, what the US is doing, and what happens next. Again, thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. As a reminder, please feel welcome to submit any questions you have in our Q&A section. We will try to get to as many as we possibly can on this very dynamic, very urgent story. Joining me to try to make sense of all of it are Negar Mortazavi, editor and host of the Iran podcast and senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and Sina Tusi, who is also a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy as well. Thank you both for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
So, we have some breaking news on this matter, but first, I want to situate our listeners a little bit. To start out with, very basically, how would you describe what is happening in Iran right now? And Nagar, we could start with you, perhaps.
Sure. So, just to give you a quick overview, there has been mass protests, anti-government protests in Iran that started about 2 weeks ago in the heart of Tehran's bazaar, as a response to the devaluation of the Iranian currency and a certain austerity measure. The government removed a specific subsidy that was meant for merchants in the bazaar and was trying to move around the cash from that subsidy to the end users, and that sparked the protests. Initially, we saw the closing of shops in the form of strikes, and the protests were really starting in the bazaar. But then in about a week, the protests start spreading beyond the bazaar, beyond Tehran. In fact, they slowed down in the Tehran bazaar, but they spread to other cities and towns, dozens and dozens across Iran. And then came a shutdown of communication and a crackdown of the protesters. And the latest we've heard is that the death toll is very high, over 2,000 at least have been killed, potentially even more. Thousands have been injured, many thousands have been arrested. And there's also concern for the fate of those arrested, the charges, the rush courts, as we've seen in the past, and potentially harsh sentencing. And we've also seen sort of a response from the US in the form of President Trump posting online anywhere between from the US being locked and loaded to respond to the Iranians, to the US being ready to meet with the Iranians for diplomacy when they call it, and then to the US canceling all meetings. And then just today, he said it seems like the killing has stopped in Iran. And so that could be an indication that he doesn't want to take action. We are also seeing military movement in the region. That was an indication of a potential um, some form of action coming. U.S. has been moving personnel out of certain bases. There has been other movements with the tankers, etc. So it's very unclear. But what we know on the ground, at least, is that after the crackdown, the protests have slowed. We haven't seen big crowds in the past couple of days. And yeah, I guess these 2 days, there's been all eyes have been on the U.S. to see if there will be a potential reaction, if it's going to be kinetic, non-kinetic. There could also be cyber options, etc. But I'm happy to get into more details. Just that's just a quick bird's eye view.
Thank you, thank you. And Sina, Nagar mentioned the fact that this started in some respects initially because of discontent amongst shopkeepers in the bazaars. Could you maybe speak to, firstly, of course, anything else that you would want to add about basically what's happening in Iran, but then also speak to perhaps the significance of how these protests first began and how they blew up to what they've become now?
Yeah, I'd say, there's this short, more immediate context, and there's a bigger context. I mean, the bigger context, in short, is that this isn't the first nationwide protest wave in Iran. I'm sure many of your viewers know, just a couple years ago, there was a 2022 Women Life Freedom Movement. Prior to that, like in November 2019, there were nationwide protests after sparked by a hike in the price of gasoline. The 2009 Green Movement, for example, was arguably still the biggest protest movement in terms of like the number of people who came out in Tehran, for example, which was in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And so the drivers behind these protests are arguably the same. The economic discontent has gotten worse, and that was the shock this time. But for many Iranians who, have faced from their government, from the Islamic Republic, an exclusionary form of governance where they've been denied many political, social, and just political and social rights and many regulations, like, for many years, the mandatory hijab, which has become more lax since the Women Life Freedom Movement. But, and then in the context of deteriorating economic conditions, which catalyzed, as you said, this round of protests. So this started on December 28th in a part of the Tehran Bazaar that is a sector for mobile phone merchants and other merchants who sell technological goods and imported technology. And so this is obviously a sector that is heavily impacted by a sharply depreciating Iranian currency. People can't afford to buy these expensive foreign goods. And so that initial day of protests, some of these stores, they went on strike and their slogans were focused on economic grievances and not political slogans. But in this overall context of deep-seated grievance, high inflation, a lot of Iranians falling into poverty in the past 10 years, really. These protests, we saw they quickly spilled out of the bazaar, those initial days, other parts of Tehran, and then they moved more in the provinces, more in these kind of smaller cities, mid-sized cities in kind of more rural parts of Iran. But with that said, there were reoccurring protests in parts of Tehran. It did actually come to the bazaar again at some point later on. An initial hotspot was in western Iran and Elam province in near the border on the border with Iraq. I think one notable thing about the first about 10 days of these protests is that the government was relatively restrained in terms of the crackdown compared to how it's been in the past. So Pezeshkian, the reformist president, kind of gave olive branches rhetorically, said he tried to say that there's a distinction between, peaceful protests, that people have a right to protest for economic grievances, and then, what they describe as riots. But regardless, I thought it was notable that there were some big rallies in those first 10 days that security forces did not intervene. With that said, there was heavy-handed repression and violent repression as well, and clashes in those first days. And there were about 40 to 50 casualties and fatalities among protesters that were killed by security forces in those first 10 days. The big tipping point, however, came last Thursday when actually after Reza Pahlavi, and we can get back and we can unpack this more later, but Reza Pahlavi, the former crown prince, the son of the Shah, who was ousted in 1979, he called for demonstrators to take to the streets. And so we had actually for the first time, because he's called for many such protests in Iran for decades, really. And this was the first time that actually people took to the streets, after one of his calls. And I can offer my explanation for why that happened. But regardless, that's when the government shut down the internet Thursday night. It's been the most severe internet shutdown that they have done. And we've seen this brutal crackdown now, a really violent crackdown where, according to credible sources, in my view, that it seems roughly 2,500 protesters have been confirmed as having been killed. Something like 150 security forces have been confirmed as killed. And those numbers are expected to go up. And so Trump, in this context, I think, he's been trying to exploit these protests and the legitimate grievances that the people in Iran have, and to just, to meet his own geopolitical ends, his own cynical interests. And as we can see, it's very destructive for the Iranian people, where yesterday Trump said that he actually told Iranians to attack government buildings, attack institutions, help is on the way. Today, he's like, oh, executions have stopped, there's no more killing. And the Iranians tell me that they were being shot at and they shot back. And he said something like, oh, that happens. Like he said this like 10, 15 minutes ago. So it just shows that, these cynical global leader, people like Trump, that they exploit these issues in countries like Iran, and it ultimately causes much more civilian harm than help.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And just a reminder for our viewers, at any point, please feel free to submit any questions that you have, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. So Please do not be shy. I know this is a very important conversation. I know there's going to be many, many questions. Please, please, whatever is on your mind. Um, One question I have for both of you is of course, you've mentioned how there are estimations that over 2,500 people have been killed over the past few weeks. Of course, there are some that horribly estimate that number to be even higher. Um, Two sources of which were unnamed, but albeit they had told CBS that the number might be as high as 12,000. Again, that number has not been repeated elsewhere, but the point being is that there's a very large range of what kind of damage is being inflicted in Iran by the government. We don't really know what exact the extent of that is due to these communication blackouts. So what are people to make of these numbers and essentially what can people do or how can they react when there is so little information?
So yeah, as you said, there has been a communication blackout. People are slowly coming back online. I received a call today, a message from someone who was able to get online for a little bit yesterday, today, various different people, but it's still very difficult to paint a full picture, very limited images, eyewitness accounts. News organizations and human rights organizations are trying their best as much as you can from the outside. We know a lot of these figures are coming from activist organizations that are based in the US or in Europe. So it's a very difficult task to be accurate, to be diligent. The ones that do have, decent methodologies. And so over 2,000, 2,500 is, I would say, the minimum that has been documented by these organizations with confidence, with accuracy. The number could be higher. It could also go higher because this just happened. What we've seen, at least, are the limited evidence and the imaging is that bodies had been piled up in morgues, in hospitals, some even on the street, and people were called in to come in large groups, sit and look at photos or look at bodies and identify their loved ones, which suggests that there had been these mass casualties in various different cities and towns and areas. It's not just limited to one place. I want to add one other element, which I think is a fairly new pattern, and we haven't really seen it in past protests, that the Iranian state is claiming that there has been an element of armed sort of resistance or protests within these mass protests of they're suggesting groups that they call quote unquote terrorists, but we have seen some imaging that suggests maybe levels of coordination or potentially armed individuals. We're also hearing similar messaging coming from Israeli officials. We had Mike Pompeo at the very beginning, former US Secretary of State and the head of CIA at the very beginning, saying, wishing well for every Iranian protester, and then saying behind every protester is a Mossad agent on the ground, which I don't even think that's humanly possible. But these are statements that also are taken seriously and heard and repeated and used as cover or excuse by Iranian officials and the Iranian state. So again, when I say it's difficult to paint a clear picture, there's all of these various different layers that are added to it. And as Sina also pointed, the protests really had two phases. The beginning, it seemed like the government actually wanted to take a moderate approach to meet with the leaders of the protests in the bazaar, and you had the president, the spokesperson of the administration out there constantly saying that these grievances are legitimate. Of course, the status quo is not bearable and people are upset at the state of the economy, and promising economic changes, even delivering some of these cash subsidies to millions of Iranians. But then the protest took a turn, a sharp turn, I would say, essentially a shift. And then came the second phase where we saw these images of violence and the crackdown and the shutdown and all of that started. And the communication shutdown is also first and foremost to prevent more mobilization of the protesters, communication between the protesters on the ground from news sharing, info sharing within the country. And then, of course, it hampers the communication with the outside as well. So it's very complex. There are a lot of unknowns. And what we know is that the protests have slowed down, but I don't think this is the end. When the grievances are not addressed, we've seen that these rounds of mass protests that really spread like wildfire keep coming back 2022, 2019, and before. So I'm expecting maybe not immediately, but again, more rounds of mass protests coming with the next spark.
So one of these unknowns that both of you have gotten at this point, and some of our questioners are getting at as well, is this idea of outside actors seeking to exploit what might already be a sort of popular uprising within Iran. So there's two questions I want to pose to you kind of in tandem. One is from Roxana Soltani, who asks for both of your opinions on whether, in fact, Israel is involved in instigating these protests and fueling any sort of government opposition, given, for instance, the fact that Mossad suggests that they're on the ground, Mike Pompeo's comments as well. That's one question. And then, moreover, from John Hargett, he asks if this protest does succeed in toppling the regime, how likely is it that the post-revolutionary leadership are not puppets of the US empire? So, question one, whether there is indeed this element of outside agitation, or at least attempts to, by whether it's the US or Israel or what have you. And then, secondarily, if this revolution does succeed in challenging the regime, how likely is it that there might be some sort of puppetry of the US empire subsequently? So, Sina, let's start with you.
Sure. I don't think those are mutually exclusive. Like the Iranian people have legitimate grievances. There's a long history of dissent and protest in Iran. And at the same time, these external powers, namely Israel and the US, that have their own geopolitical aims with respect to Iran and the Islamic Republic that arguably has nothing to do with human rights or democracy. They're rivals in the region. And there's obviously other governments in the region, Israel itself, that has, been credibly accused of a genocide, all these other human rights violators in the region. So, their criticisms or rivalry on Iran has nothing to do with that, but they're happy to exploit these protests and foment unrest to the extent that they can. And I think, a big part of, the economic conditions in Iran, the decisive part, I would argue, is the sanctions regime and this has been the goals of the sanctions to create such a destructive environment domestically to impoverish people, increase poverty, and push people into the streets. This is the quiet part that many people are increasingly saying out loud. And to the point on foreign intervention right now, it is very striking to me that they are so unabashed. Generally, you're seeing these remarks from Mike Pompeo talking about Mossad, many Israeli outlets, officials, former officials, voices from Israel that are talking about that openly. And as Negar said, this just does nothing to help the protesters in Iran. It justifies much more brutal repression against them, and feeds into the Iranian government's narrative that this is all foreign orchestration, which they've used to convince their base and mobilize their own base. So it just really creates a more polarized, destructive environment within Iran, which may very well actually be fine for Israel. I don't think their strategic goal is for Iran to transition to some strong, prosperous democracy. And to the point about, do they could this end in a puppet state for America? I mean, I think this is not obviously we're no longer in the 1970s or the 1950s, for example, when the Shah was in power and he had this kind of relationship with the U.S. where he was a kind of a client of the U.S. in the region or kind of a pillar of the U.S. and meeting their strategic objectives. We are in a world now where, no, even U.S. traditional partners can't count on the U.S. for security guarantees. For example, Saudi Arabia, for example, NATO, um, Taiwan. I mean, these are all open questions. So, a future Iranian state, even if it wanted to like align with America, America's not in the position anymore to give that state security guarantees and, have that kind of relationship with it. So to me, any Iranian state is going to have to some extent, have strategic flexibility, deal with all, other great powers, and have its own defense means, including missiles, including maybe a nuclear capability. So these are all questions that, sadly aren't debated as much, even amongst Iranian opposition forces. And I don't think Reza Pahlavi has a realistic chance of ever coming into power in Iran. And arguably the most well-positioned force right now to consolidate even more power, even including in the event of Khamenei, this current supreme leader, dying or being assassinated, or some deal being made with Trump that supplants him, is the IRGC, is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which already controls something like 30% of the Iranian economy, has the resources, has the personnel, has the organization on the ground to consolidate their power. So I think, the Iranian people, unfortunately, have just kind of been collateral damage. And, many forces tried to instrumentalize them and instrumentalize their legitimate grievances, but it's ultimately towards destructive ends. And I think we're seeing that right now play out in real time with Trump's rhetoric these days.
You mentioned, Negar, I want to hear from you, but before we pivot, you mentioned the idea that Reza Pahlavi is likely not going to reach power. One attendee asks whether the support for Pahlavi is mostly a diaspora thing or whether he does have a significant support base inside Iran.
So in Iran, I think it's most important to understand that there's long existed an opposition movement to the Islamic Republic, many different opposition movements, but within the country, there's been a strong, it has a history of a formidable civil society, activists, many of whom have been, lifelong activists or decades long activists pushing for reform, pushing for democratic change, ex insiders, ex officials. And I'm talking about people like Nargis Mohammadi, who won the Nobel Peace Prize a couple of years ago, ranging to, Mostafa Tajzadeh, who was an official in the reformist Khatami administration decades ago, or Mir Hussein Mousavi, who's, been under house arrest and the Green Movement leader. But there's many of these forces. There's many activists, political prisoners. And actually, the political landscape of Iran reaching this point where those activists within Iran don't have much of a voice. They don't have the kind of multi-hundred of $1 million media apparatus that the monarchists have in outlets like Iran International or Manoto that's amplifying them. They've been attacked by both the Islamic Republic and repressed by them and put in jail, where most of them are, and actually by the diaspora opposition and Reza Pahlavi. And I think the most important thing about the monarchists to realize is that they are a very exclusionary political movement. Anyone who's followed them, especially in the past couple of years, know how they're very hegemonic in their political aspirations. They're very zero sum. It's either Reza Pahlavi or nobody else. And they've attacked other opposition voices just as much as they've attacked the Islamic Republic, if not more, arguably. Even you can see just these rallies among the Iranian diaspora over the weekend, lots of fights, lots of violence. And it's mostly really from the monarchists towards other factions in the opposition. And so within Iran, though, there's legitimate support. I don't want to downplay that. There's legitimate support. And I think that support more so as reflecting an ideological attachment to Pahlavi or a monarchy, or reflecting even organization on the ground. Like he has actual organization and is coordinating protests on the ground. It's people who are desperate, people who are angry, people who are fed up with the regime in the Islamic Republic, and they think that Pahlavi is offering them a way out, and he seems to have a strategy. He seems to have, the support of America and Israel. So as a low-cost method that they are kind of chanting his name right now. Some people in some of these protests, especially in the kind of Iranian heartland, like Tehran, Esfahan, but in the periphery regions, in the ethnic minority regions, like the Kurds, the Baluch, the Azaris, they actually have a long history of opposition to the Pahlavi monarchy, and they don't like him to this day. So they're not uniting. You don't hear those slogans at all in some of these other regions of Iran. So I think, in the past, we've seen that a big chunk of Iranian society that's always wanted change, they have followed figures that they didn't really necessarily like them or wasn't their preference, but they thought maybe with this person, something could be done. So even when people, for example, voted for Hassan Rouhani in the 2013 election, after the Green Movement was violently suppressed, and many of those same dissidents voted for Rouhani, it wasn't because they liked Rouhani, but they thought, okay, this guy is going to be, he sounds different. He's promising negotiations with America. He's promising a deal with America, easing pressures on our livelihoods. They supported him. And even we've seen this time and again in Iranian politics, and even with Pezeshkian last year, many people who voted for him, it's not like they liked him or necessarily had much hope, but he seemed to be the most low-cost option. So now I think something similar is happening. And so there is this genuine, these people who are placing their hope in Pahlavi. But past this president, this could prove very fleeting, and I don't think he has the organization, the political structure abroad, and really the political platform to build an inclusive, broad social movement in Iran that could challenge the Islamic Republic and topple it. If anything, he's hedging all his hopes on foreign intervention, and I think that's where the body count, the body numbers comes into play. Where if you talk 2,500 bodies, people who have been killed and confirmed dead, deaths, by human rights organizations in the U.S. that have very rigorous verification methodology, as opposed to Barry Weiss's CBS saying 12,000. I think obviously every one of these deaths is a huge tragedy. It's horrifying. It marks a new precedent for the Islamic Republic's repression. But I think the audience in some of these huge numbers is not the Iranian people, because the Iranian people, even the Islamic Republic broadcasting some of these horrific images of morgues and people in body bags. This is to scare people off the streets, and I think it's working. You see the protests have largely dissipated since Saturday. But the audience for these big numbers is arguably Trump and trying to build justification for military attack. So I think for Reza Pahlavi and Trump yesterday in trying to encourage more protests and calling on people to attack institutions, they want more bodies, they want more instability, and they want more chaos so they can take advantage of that situation to meet their own cynical ends. But that's not going to help the Iranian people. That's not going to, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I mean, we can get into more of what could actually be done.
Well, yes, yeah. So
Yeah.
let's talk about this a bit. Firstly, a reminder, I know there's more faces that are joining us, so thank you all for joining. Please, just a reminder, if you have any questions, please submit them. We'll try to get to as many as we can. On that exact point, Sina, there we have a few commenters that are asking this question about what can be done. There's Asya Awad, thank you for your question about what can we in the West do to assist the Iranians. And then there's Sahar Qasemi who says, my entire family is in Iran and I could talk to them for 2 minutes yesterday. They've confirmed that what took place was a massacre. The latest estimates, Sahar cites the 12,000 people that have been killed that CBS reports. Sahar says that while the economic crisis has undoubtedly been a major driver of these demonstrations, Sahar wants to emphasize that human rights and the political dimensions are equally significant. People aren't just protesting economic hardship, they're demanding dignity, justice, freedoms. Sahar is wondering, given all this and how much our generation, her generation, has done to free Iran from these kinds of conditions, and given this oppression and violence, what can be done meaningfully to support Iranians in this struggle? I know you mentioned that there is a rock and a hard place, but where can people go with this? I mean, what is the exit out of this rock and a hard place for people? Because I take your point that perhaps the more that there seems to be permission for Trump to do something, he will. But if the permission is being had by the people in charge in Iran, I mean that is the reality on the ground. So what can people do from here, from their standpoint, to assist people in Iran and their struggle, and to not stay caught in this rock and the hard place? Nagar, if you'd like to start first.
Sure. So just looking at recent precedents, the Women Life Freedom movement and those protests, I think, are an excellent example. 2022, the spark was a women's rights issue in a country with, millennia, if not centuries of patriarchy that is ingrained in the culture, in the law, in state. And it's not just about the hijab or the dress code, it's every aspect of the public and private life where women feel discriminated against and really not on equal footing as men. And came the death in custody of Mahsa Amini because of how she was dressed, and that a feminist uprising, a women's uprising erupted. I call it nothing short of a revolution, but it was a cultural revolution. And I think that cultural revolution succeeded. It delivered results. Women, and it was something that was brewing for over 4 decades, because the resistance to the mandatory hijab didn't start in 2022. It started right after the revolution when hijab was mandated. I've heard this from my own mother, my aunt, my grandmother, women of that generation who were suddenly forced to wear this mandatory hijab as a result of the revolution. The sort of reaction was what? We didn't see this coming. And so that resistance came, and then it built up and built up. And I think 2022 was really that explosion moment, and they were able to push the state back, um, not voluntarily. I mean, the state gave up to a point that I don't think it's reversible. The genie is out of the bottle, and women really were able to change the way they dress and really the image of public life in Iran, not just in big cities, but in small towns across the country. And so that protest movement, and it came at a very high price. People were killed, injured, arrested, but it delivered something. It delivered something. So when we say the fate of Iran or an Iranian people should be decided by the Iranian people, there is precedent. There is precedent of Iranians being able to push the state back and make gains and sort of change the status quo for the better or the way they want. Um, I don't think foreign military intervention is going to help the cause. I mean, when I get asked this a lot in interviews, if the US intervention can help. First of all, what kind of intervention? I'd like to see what the options are because the US options are many. You know, it's a mighty military. It can destroy the entire region if it wanted to. The president has said he doesn't want to commit boots on the ground. So we're not looking at another Iraq or Afghanistan, which were both disasters. But I ask people, are you thinking a Libya model, sustained airstrikes without boots on the ground? How is that going to help a movement, on the ground of protesters achieving better governance or democracy, more representation, less corruption? So maybe, these foreign powers do have a lot of power, but sometimes no good options. And when we talk about the future really being decided by the Iranian people, that's really the core of it. And one other point I wanted to add to what Sina was saying is that the state of the economy is the result of a triangle of three factors that are very much connected. It's mismanagement of resources. It's a country rich in natural resources, human capital. It's one of the largest in the region, one of the most populated, very educated, very young population. And the resources have been mismanaged. There's a water crisis, electricity shortage, the economy, etc. There's massive corruption at various different levels. So this government subsidy that was removed and led to the protests in the bazaar was one instance when the government was saying we're providing the subsidy, but it looks like it's led to a lot of corruption within these mid-level. There's corruption in lower level, mid-level, and then in very high levels. There's even a class of elite that has been created called sanctions profiteers, kasabane tahrim, people who literally have been profiting, gaining wealth and power from the sanctions. And then the third factor is sanctions, is this external factor. Iran is one of the most sanctioned countries in the world. Every major and small industry in the country has been sanctioned, if not more than once, multiple times. And these sanctions have really had an impact, and the impact has been on average Iranians, working class, middle class Iranians, minus that elite that I was talking about. And it's really pushed the society to wherever their economic class was into a lower bracket. And these three factors are connected. So if we're talking about the state of the economy, where the responsibility lies, first and foremost, of course, with the Iranian state, but also there's this external factor. And if change were to come, and governments have come and gone, presidents, elected officials, and they've promised that they're going to crack down on corruption and the mismanagement. But the issue of sanctions is a matter of foreign policy, of Iran's foreign policy posturing, Iran's regional policy. This is the fight between Iran and the US, which is also related to Israel. So unless there's a major rethinking in Tehran and a shifting of gears, I think on this issue comprehensively, we're not going to see a better trajectory for the Iranian economy and for a changing of the status quo, which for many Iranians has become unbearable. I mean, I can't think of anyone who I speak to on the ground in Iran who says, oh yeah, I'm very happy with my life and it's going great, or I see a better prospect. Everyone complains. And these are middle classes, working classes that I talk to. I'm not talking about the elite, but the majority of the population is under this very high inflation, raising up prices, and life has just gotten more and more difficult.
Sahar had mentioned, of course, there's the crippling economic situation, but of course also the human rights situation. As both of you have kind of alluded to, just before this began, President Trump held a press conference in which he said that he had been told, quote, on good authority, that plans for executions in Iran had stopped, even while Iran has signaled those executions are still to come. He did say, who knows, and that military action is not off the table. Adnan Durrani brings up a good point that when Bush attacked Iraq during Desert Storm long ago, and when Trump last year attacked Iran, the narrative, or the dog whistles, as Adnan puts it, was as Bush said, I have nothing against the Iraqi people, and Trump, I support the Iranian people, and so on and so forth. And so, with statements like these from Trump expressing concern for the Iranian people and kind of flip-flopping as to what he's going to do, Sina, do you think we can trust Trump on any of this, given him and his predecessors' past dog whistling when it comes to Iran?
I mean, I don't think any rational person who's followed Donald Trump could think that he possibly has the best interests of the Iranian people in mind, or he actually cares about repression or things like this. So, for him, it's a political calculation. How's this going to play to project him as a tough guy, strong man, someone who follows through on threats, and it could play well to his base. Um, so to that extent, it is interesting. These remarks today don't really help him in that regard. I mean, Trump has a knack for basically creating his own reality and political reality and kind of getting, even if he's ostensibly put himself in a corner, like tweeting, if Iran kills somebody, I'm going to bomb them. And then he kind of can twist reality, and he's giving himself a way out, it seems, by saying that, oh, they're not killing anyone. They've stopped killing. They're not going to do executions. And he also said something like, I was told that they were getting shot at, and then they shot back. So it seems like, there is some kind of communication happening with the Iranian authorities. Interestingly, I just saw that the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi is on Fox News tonight. And Trump ultimately does not want a big war. I think that's evident in his foreign policy track record. And so even as he uses military strikes in a very brazen way and in a way that I think is ultimately carefully calibrated to not get himself in a big war, but also to project this kind of tough man image. But he's wanted to deal with Iran. And I think of
Do you think
Trump.
it's, sorry to interrupt, Sina, do you think it's calibrated or that he has just been able to, because of how erratically he behaves, people have not retaliated? Because one could go down the list of all the ways that he's in fact escalated quite heavily.
Well, I think it's kind of debatable because, even with respect to the Iran attack, for example, it was a one-off strike on the nuclear facilities. There were reports that there was a communication and heads up giving to Iran that this would be a one-off strike and telling them to limit their counterstrike. And, there was even satellite pictures of trucks all at the Iranian nuclear facilities, seemingly evacuating equipment and everything. I think the efficacy of those strikes, there's a lot of open questions about those strikes. The Maduro kidnapping is also, it's unclear exactly what the implications of that will be, but he's lowered the military presence in the Caribbean. It seemed like it was kind of a one-off thing, and he seems happy with what he's gotten so far, even though it's unclear exactly what kind of strategic gain the U.S. has gotten. So I think it's debatable exactly, Trump's willingness to use military force in a big way. So far, I would argue that the evidence suggests that he prefers kind of limited symbolic actions as opposed to getting in, ground troops and getting sucked into like a long open-ended conflict. Especially right now, we are in an election year, but at the same time, he's really adopted this kind of madman doctrine on steroids. So he's really tried to project himself as very unpredictable. And I think, countries like Iran, these kind of mid-tier powers who have a lot to lose, maybe if America got in a big war with Iran, yeah, it's going to be costly for America for some period of time. The price of gasoline will go up. They'll take casualties. Maybe Republicans will lose bigger in the midterms. But Iran can face devastation, carpet bombing, its oil and gas facilities destroyed. So they've been quite restrained, actually, Iran. But it seems like their restraint, arguably ever since the Soleimani assassination in 2020, has led the US and Israel to continue to go up on the escalation ladder. That's why, a lot of the rhetoric you're seeing coming out of Iran since June, and especially last week when they changed their defense policy doctrine, talking about preemptive attack and the potential for them doing a preemptive attack. It seems like the Iranians, in another round of conflict with the US and Israel, are wanting to go much higher on the escalation ladder immediately, like in terms of inflicting US casualties, destabilizing the Persian Gulf, these kind of tangible things that would increase the political cost for Trump. And it's going to be a gamble for the Iranians. At that point, it's going to be, testing Trump. Is he bluffing? Is he really going to go to a big war where he can face hundreds of casualties, potential big costs, or will he back off? And there's a trajectory for, like Reagan in the 80s, for example, after the Beirut bombing that resulted in hundreds of US casualties, he pulled out of Lebanon, So it's like, Trump, does he want another big quagmire in the Middle East or not? That's been the Iranian leadership's kind of decision-making issue. And it seems like right now, he's kind of weaning off of an attack. If we are to take him at his word, which obviously I think no sane person would, and even with these remarks today, let's not forget that ahead of the June war, Iran was in negotiations with America. Iran had a round of talks scheduled for that Sunday, which the US and Witkoff said was going to go ahead despite all the talk of war then. And then Netanyahu and Israel launched a surprise attack on Friday. And many people now argue that all those negotiations were strategic deception and duping Iran. Now, maybe there's something similar going on, although I don't really understand the logic of it, because I doubt Trump saying this right now is anyone in Iran is lowering their guard or their military readiness. But that could be part of what's happening as well, is some kind of deception operation.
Nagar, what do you make of this, especially given, I think Sina is right to point out that it's unclear how much more this would impact people within Iran based on Trump's track record. At the same time, one might wonder if Trump saying, I've been told on good authority that the executions have stopped, even though he might know that they are not going to stop, that he's in fact building pretext. So I wonder how you're sort of responding to Trump's sort of oscillating public comments, as well as your thoughts on potential Israeli military involvement as well.
Well, I agree with Sina and what you're saying, From. I think the brand of the president is unpredictability, and so that's what's on display. This could be a ruse, a cover for an attack that he's trying to hide, or at the same time, this could be him changing his mind, and both of which he's done very well in the past, and the result looks the same. So it's very hard unless you're in his mind, and also considering that the decision making changes. But I think one lesson that the Iranians took from June, the war in June, was that they now take his threats seriously. Before then, it was, give and take, although there was also the assassination of the top Iranian general Qasem Soleimani in January 2020. But I think when he came back to the White House for the second term, Iran's posturing and Trump as well. He stopped talking about Qasem Soleimani in that episode, and the Iranians also treated it like water under a bridge and a new person in the White House, in a way, new administration, and that's how they engaged in negotiations 6 rounds before the Israeli attacks came. But then I think the June attack really changed the calculation, and now you have a very strong camp in Iran and a strong argument that all of this is a ruse. All of this is a cover, and ultimately, what they want is weakening and attacking and the military option. What Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying on the record, pushing the U.S. for 2 decades since the invasion of Iraq, all the way till today. Every U.S. administration, he's been trying to push to attack Iran, and not just a Libya model, but even an Iraq model invasion, boots on the ground. And so I think that level of mistrust in Tehran is now very, very high after June. And for the Israelis also, because Iran and Israel were engaged in a shadow war for years, and that war came out of the shadows in the past couple of years after October 7th with back and forth engagements. And then in June, it turned into an actual reality. So Israeli threats against Iran are no longer theory or hypothesis. US military threats, which previous even Democratic administrations, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, and Trump himself, they would always say all options are on the table, including military, but that materialized in June. So these are taken very seriously, and I think that's one of the reasons also, like Sina was saying, that Iran's posturing has also changed since June. The messaging, both public and private, to the Israelis has been that if you attack us again next time, we're going to hit back much, much harder. And they've been sort of in a prepared posturing to remove that element of surprise, which the Israelis used in June, that gave them the upper hand, at least at the very beginning of that war. And the messaging to the US is also, like Sina is saying, because that's also very strong criticism inside Iran, that Iran has reacted to the US, especially to this administration, with a lot of restraint and predictability. So they escalate, the Americans and the Israelis escalate, but Iran's next step is predictable. And they act as a rational actor who doesn't want to escalate, who wants to take an off ramp, and the responses are measured and calibrated, meant to not escalate, but rather de escalate. And that has given the other side the upper hand to continue to escalate without fear. And I think that has changed since June, both towards the Israelis and the Americans, and especially the past week since the protests and the crackdown really picked up in Tehran. We saw, interestingly, the Speaker of Parliament, who used to be an IRGC, a senior official in the IRGC, essentially saying that US bases across the region are all legitimate targets, that Israel will be a target, and if the US attacks, Iran will still go after Israel. It's not going to wait for Israel to go after Israel. If US attacks, it will go after. And when we talk about US bases, these are bases in Arab countries, Iran's Arab neighbors, especially the ones in the Persian Gulf, Arab countries, and the monarchies across the Persian Gulf, who really care about stability and not just their safety and security, but these are countries that are not used to these kinds of wars, like some of the other war-torn countries. They care about their trade, their economic states. Saudi Arabia has this long vision, UAE, all of them. And so any form of chaos across the water is just going to spill over into these neighboring countries. The Iraqis are worried, the Turks are worried. I mean, you look at Syria, a decade of civil war, the war refugees ended up in Turkey and neighboring countries. These are all considerations of the neighbors, of the calculations, and the pressure does translate in Washington. We saw in the reporting the Qataris, the Omanis, the Saudis were trying to do advocacy with the administration to prevent a military option, saying that this is going to spill beyond Iran's borders and impact all of us in the neighborhood.
I have a few final questions that, if we can keep brief, just because I know there's quite a few that we want to get through from the audience, and now we're running on time here, so we'll try to keep them brief, please. As Sina, you mentioned, not only is are people in Iran stuck within a hard place, but the discourse itself is kind of stuck between Iraq and a hard place as well. I'm curious, how has it been for you to talk about this subject freely and from your perspectives? I know both of you have faced criticism from your view for your views in the past. I'm curious, just how difficult has it been, and how have you navigated that conversation?
I mean, just speaking for myself, I wouldn't necessarily say it's been difficult for me. I mean, I try to be as objective as possible and as kind of rigorous as possible with my analysis. And I think really the facts and the trajectory of developments in US-Iran relations speak for themselves. Obviously, in times of immense pain and suffering, like these killings that we're seeing in Iran, everyone is upset and angry, and justifiably so, as are me, and I'm sure Negar and all of us. So I totally understand that some people want a kind of quick fix to these problems, and I can, people as a neat, kind of gut reaction, or like, all these people are being killed in Iran, let's go and attack and liberate these people. But I think, we just need to be conscientious of the history, all the actors at play. So, for example, me and a lot of my work, we've been arguing for years that, how is it the policies of maximum pressure and sanctions that are explicitly designed to immiserate a population, how is it that helps this population achieve democratic change or achieve a positive future? I've never heard anyone, in a compelling way, give an answer that this is how it's supposed to do that. I mean, I think my understanding, and I think, this is how the policy was designed, and even its implementers say this, many of them, is that this is designed not to help the people achieve a better future, but to immiserate them, impoverish them, create a destructive situation. And this situation was predictable, as long as with the US trying to starve the population, basically, an unprecedented siege, blocking its oil exports, blocking its financial transactions. And, we can say this regime brought it upon itself. But regardless, the net effect is that this is being inflicted and diplomacy has been cast aside. I mean, there was a working nuclear deal. We can engage the counterfactual of if that nuclear deal was allowed to work, if Trump did not leave it in 2018, would all the escalations we've seen in the past 10 years happen? Would October 7th have happened? I mean, there's relations between all these. I'm not trying to say it wouldn't have happened, but there's a relationship. And then with this overall US approach to have a zero-sum approach in the Middle East towards Iran, towards, the Palestinians, towards, other kind of actors in the region. And so escalation has happened. So in many ways, it was predictable that as an outcome of these policies, and I personally have been arguing this for years, that the Iranian government was growing more hardline, more repressive. The situation was not becoming conducive for democratic change because the academic literature teaches us that this is not how you achieve change, political change. This is not how you build revolutionary movements. You need a strong civil society. You need a strong middle class. You need connections with the outside world, not isolation, not breaking the civil society, empowering the most hardline actors in these societies. And, it's held true for Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, many other places. And this just creates a more destructive situation. So I think these are things we need to be honest about and, be factual about and be objective about. And that can let us really ascertain what is the best pathway forward. Is it to continue these policies? Is it to have war? Is a U.S. military intervention going to actually help improve situation in Iran? How has it turned out in Libya? How has it turned out in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, for the Palestinians, in Lebanon? I mean, we're not short of examples. I welcome a good example. So I think we just need to be aware and let the facts lead us, and at the same time be very understanding of the suffering that's being inflicted from the Iranian government, from the American government, and try to do our best to help the people. The Iranian people right now need internet access. They need actual support, economic relief. They don't even have, people talk about people should go on strike. They don't have money to go on strike. I was hearing from a colleague that his brother had a company, he has a company in Iran, and he was trying to hire a truck driver. And truck drivers are something many people abroad call for strikes. The truck drivers in Iran should go on strike. And he said within a day he had over 50 applications for this one position. So people are poor, people need money, people need jobs, they have no, so it's very easy for us to sit abroad and say we should support military strikes, more sanctions, more, but in terms of the tangible impact, the track record of these policies is more destructive for the people and for the cause of democratic change.
Nagar, how about you? How have you sort of navigated speaking on the
Yeah.
subject?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And just to add to what Sina was saying, first of all, I don't like to make myself part of the story. I try to not do that as much as possible. And if it weren't for this landscape that I'm just about to explain, it wouldn't, because our job, I mean, I'm a veteran journalist, job has been to report and now to analyze, like Sina is saying, we see it and analyze it, try to be professional, nuanced, look at the various different aspects. And I think, and to your point, Prem, I mean, I welcome criticism. I wish it was criticism, and it's gotten to the point of smear attacks, physical threats against ourselves, our loved ones, attempts to silence us, get us fired, defunded, canceled from the events. There's been waves and waves of these attacks, and we found out that there's also sort of state actors, state adjacent funding behind these kinds of attacks for anyone who brings nuance into the Iran discourse in the US, and also has been seen as sort of a challenge to that agenda of more wars and more sanctions and these very hawkish policies. Of course, like Sina is saying, it's nothing compared to the suffering that many inside Iran have gone through, specifically journalists, brave journalists in Iran who have to face imprisonment, been banned from their work, and lots and lots of trouble. So I don't want to minimize any of that, but it's just unfortunate that the discourse and the landscape over here has also been targeting a group of us, a certain type of journalists, analysts, academics who have been trying to provide nuance and a different, fresh thinking and policy recommendations in Washington and in some other Western capitals. But nevertheless, like Sina is saying, we've been trying. It's had a reverse impact on some of our colleagues. People have left the industry. It's been harder on women. These kinds of threats and attacks, people have turned into self-censorship, or if they're retreated into their corner. Some have less social media, don't promote their work, don't do a lot of public work, which is very unfortunate. We've lost some of these sensible voices from the public space, but it's just a very toxic environment that's created, and it's also perpetuated by certain groups in the diaspora and certain, policy circles in Washington and other Western capitals. But there's also, organizations, outlets like yours, Zeteo, and others that I'm very grateful for that do a different kind of coverage and looking and provide a platform to bring this kind of nuance and fresh thinking to this issue.
Well, to that point, and I want to keep this as brief as possible just because I know folks have to get out of here. Thank you all for sharing all this time with us. We have two people asking kind of a similar question, one an anonymous attendee and one Jane Crowther about information. Obviously, as we've spoken at great length, there are different groups that want to exploit and get in on this issue. There's also the basic fact of information blackouts. Where can people get accurate, independent, and trustworthy information to the best of their ability on everything happening within Iran?
Man, well, Zeteo is a good place you guys are a good outlet, but I mean, I think, in this, our information landscape is in a period of great disruption, obviously, with in this transition period with social media, with the internet, now with AI. So we are in disruptive times, and I think, that is materializing itself in our politics and across the world in every society. But it's ultimately up to the individual themselves to seek out you know, good sources of information. I mean, every outlet generally, I would say, has some kind of bias. It's good to get to the bottom of those biases, try to ascertain where they're coming from. But at the same time, I think for as much as we are in an age of disinformation, misinformation, a lot of social media manipulation, we're also in a golden age of a lot of amazing journalists and outlets that are being formed. And so I can see the light at the end of the tunnel. I see in like seriously, like outlets like Zeteo, Mehdi Hassan, I mean, so many other great journalists who are being very objective, who are trying to actually hold power to account and be much more rigorous and not kind of being soft on centers of power. And that is what journalism, I defer to you guys as journalists, but, is what it's all about. So I think it's ultimately we have to exercise our own critical thinking skills. And there's a lot of good reporters and analysts out there, and kind of the onus is on us to find those out and try to have a diverse array of sources, listen to every side, and then make the best judgments according to our
That's
own. Yeah.
I'm
that's the goal, Nagar. Do you have any
Yeah,
specific recommendations of any of those folks we ought to reach out to?
yeah, I don't want to name names, but I just had to add to Sina's point. I think it's important, and like he's saying, we're in a golden age of a lot of options. Not all of them are good, but it's important to diversify. So, for example, one criticism I have at U.S. media is that you have this sense that it's this, separate entity, separate pillar that's holding truth to power, very independent of the government. There is no government funded or sponsored media in the US, unlike most other countries around the world, and that these are truth seekers that you see facts, etc. For those of us who cover foreign policy, especially Middle East policy, we see a very different layer of that in American media. I'm talking about legacy, the gatekeepers, old names that you can think of, and they haven't really been providing that critical challenge to the policies of Washington, talk about the Iraq War, talk about Afghanistan, every foreign policy decision that they go is way back to Vietnam. They haven't really challenged U.S. foreign policy thinking as they should have as reporters and analysts. So For example, I wouldn't just rely on American media for coverage of U.S. foreign policy. I would, there are Middle Eastern outlets like Zeteo and others, and also new media, more independent in the form of podcasts, websites, individuals, journalists, analysts that people can follow wherever on social media, online podcasts, whatever. But I think it's important to diversify and try to see different viewpoints, and not really focus or put all your eggs in the basket of one outlet.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, we'll have to leave it there. I have to say, selfishly agree that we need to be supporting new media such as Zeteo. We appreciate everyone who has joined us today. We appreciate you participating. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all your questions, but to the ones we got to, I really appreciate it. I think that very much informed and made this conversation better. So thank you for your participation, your support, your readership. Please continue to support Zeteo so we can keep having important, nuanced conversations such as these. Thank you all so much. Please take care. Sina Tusi, Negar Mortasavi. Thank you both for joining us, sharing your time. Unfortunately, this story will continue to develop and hopefully towards a better end, as we all hope. So please stay in touch. Please, all of you, keep looking out for more of our reporting on this important issue. Thank you all very much. Take care. See you all soon.
Thank you, Prem.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.